Hello everyone, my name is Misti Gaither and welcome to Quest, a journey into true crime and the paranormal. I am so excited, and for those of you who watch the show, you know how I am about the Axeman in New Orleans, and I love talking about him. Research, not just the research, but I do some paranormal investigations at the alleged Axeman Hotel called the Haunted Hotel. I'm having my second annual Axeman lockdown weekend. And I have with me Vincent Chip LoCoco, and he is the author of The Devil's Jazz. And as you can tell, he brought props. Now, this is not the actual Axeman's axe. They did find an axe.
They did, in the wall.
Hotel.
Yes,
yeah,
in the wall.
And so I got to hold it last year. But this is, just to let y'all know, a disclaimer, this is not the real axe. But I do appreciate the props you brought. So how you doing, Chip?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here tonight.
Now, what kind of caught your attention, or what kind of made you gravitate to research and really get into this story?
I've written other novels, and all my novels were Italian historical fiction novels that took place in Sicily. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write a novel about New Orleans, and I started out by wanting to write about Little Palermo, which is where the Sicilian immigrants, when they arrived in New Orleans, lived in the lower French Quarter. And as I started to research and started to think about what type of story I wanted to tell, the story of the Axeman just always kept coming up. And I really thought it was such a fascinating story, and one that is not very well known. It's starting to get better well known because people like you talking about it. But I can tell you, as a kid, I never really even heard of the Axeman. And I would just say now it's starting to come out more and more. It's a tale that I find is not well told all the time because it really downplays the fear. And that's what I want to kind of talk about tonight. Is this was a very fearful time for New Orleans, in particular for Sicilian immigrants.
Yeah, because you think about it, they got a lot of their information, back then you had the newspapers, and that was just about it, because I'm not even sure about radio back in 1910, 12. There may be some movies, but I mean, they wasn't at that time going to all of a sudden start making a movie about him because they didn't even know. But, newspapers was really primarily a way for everybody to communicate. And what I've noticed, because I do a lot of research on for the show and different subjects, is like back then, they detailed.
Correct.
And now it's more like, hey, they died and,
Correct.
And move on. And that's what you're talking about, the fear, because, the people would get
They would.
And they would read, like, okay, he was standing over them and he,
It was very detailed, yeah. and the headlines themselves would be who's next and who's he coming for next and that kind of stuff. And, the way he attacked people with the axe, of course, was terrible. Mm-hmm. The scenes, some of the police department, you'll see in some of the newspaper articles, the police will say the most gruesome scene they've seen since being on the police department. So these are not just, your average everyday killings. These were brutal beatdowns with an axe.
The most popular things are like from 1918 to like 1919.
Correct.
But you have a theory, and some others have a theory that it started possibly 1910. Correct.
At that time, the first attack, they believe, was on a gentleman by the name of August Cruty and his wife. That happened on August the 13th of 1910. At that time, after he committed 3 different attacks, killing one person. He killed Joe Davy, which was a brutal beating. And at the time, he was known as the Cleaver because he was using a meat cleaver to kill these people. There was a young detective. He was known as the Italian expert on the police force. He was Italian. His name was John D'Antoni. And he's the one who investigated the Cleaver attacks back in 1910 and 1911. He had a illness. So he had retired from the police department around 1917, 1918, right when the Axeman comes back. And he's kind of the one who starts to realize and will start trying to get into the news media that these are connected. This is the same guy from back then. He was a fascinating individual. The guy in my novel, I have a protagonist who's based on him. He's a retired detective, and that's who tells kind of the story. That's how you kind of follow through in the story, is this retired detective as he's trying to piece together what's going on. The news media and a lot of the local citizens who are not of Sicilian heritage believed that this was a mafia hit. These were just mafia. This is the way the Italians got back at each other. And him, along with the police chief who had taken over, started to realize this is more than just, this was not mafia connected at all.
So he was active allegedly, like at least till 1919.
1919, at least they think that's when he disappeared, right? So
So where did he go?
Well, I'll say this. So 5 months. Think about that. So his first attack when he came back. Let's say if you believe he was the cleaver, when he came back, his first attack was in May of 1918. He was done in October of 1919. That's the last one. So it's for 5 months is when his reign of terror, let's say, was here. His first attack when he came back in May of 1918 was on Joseph Maggio, and that's the one that the police say was the most brutal killing of them all. He was spread out across the bed. His wife was killed. It was just a terrible, terrible scene for those policemen. I think that really left a lot of them, stung with how brutal it really was. Where did he go? They don't know. That some people will say he went up north, and they'll say he was killing in other places. Some people say he died, although I just don't know what happened to him. Then, of course, there's the people who think he was a spirit, and as spirits do, he disappeared.
Disappeared, moved on to the next one, or maybe I had someone, like I was telling you on the show that I recorded before about the Zodiac, and they're still 50-something years later, they don't know, and it's still like Correct. The enigma and everything, and the Axeman lives on. I think
at the time they didn't have serial killers in 1918.
Oh no, they didn't even know what they were.
They didn't know what they were.
Yeah.
So I remember there's a great, I think John D'Antoni, the police chief, the policeman who we're talking about, the retired one, had gone to the news media to try to get out, and I think I want to quote, let me just quote his one thing, because he was trying, I guess, to give what he believed who this Axeman was. Mm-hmm. And what he says is that he says that basically he's like a Jekyll and Hyde type, that he's going to hide, he'll be a normal person every day of the week, and all of a sudden, just like a light goes off, and he'll kill. And he's a criminal, the dual personality type. He may be respectable, law-abiding citizen, but then the impulses come upon him, and he must obey them. He's akin to Jack the Ripper because his actions seem compulsive and random. Investigations in their infancy back then, they didn't have the techniques that we have. John D'Antoni really was on to trying to figure out what was the mind of this killer. And that he was, I'd say he's kind of one of the first, particularly in America, the first detective who was trying to put together like the mind of a serial killer.
Yeah, because that's definitely not an easy feat to do. Because
and I think in the way he would kill people was, he'd use their own axe, which I think is interesting. So I guess in those days people kept their axes outside.
Yeah, and he would
chop the wood.
He would just pick it up.
Yep. But he would go to the door, and the door in those days would normally have 4 panels, the little panels on all parts of the door, and he would remove one panel and come into the house. How he got in the house, they're unsure, because he was seen by the people who lived, so they could give a description somewhat. He was 5'10", he was a big guy, a white gentleman, wearing work clothes. That's what makes him think he was at the hotel, because I think they think he was a worker there,
right,
who lived there. But how he got into the house, they're not sure. So did he have someone go in, a smaller person go into the house? Not sure. It was really when Joseph Romano was killed. He was and most of these people who were killed, if I could mention this, they were all grocery owners, little neighborhood grocery owners down in, not so much in the French Quarter, but just right outside the outskirts of the French Quarter. Joseph Romano was a barber who lived with his family. His other family members were all part of, they all owned the grocery, and he was killed. And he had a niece who lived at the house with them. Her name was Paulina Romano, who saw the Axeman leave. And it's one of those haunting moments, and I love this part in my book, when the police chief is interviewing her and says, well, how did he leave? And she goes, he just left. He just left. And he goes, well, what do you mean he just left? And her response was, it's like he had wings. And if you read the newspaper articles back then, it was all about he's a phantom. Like they really honed in on this is a spirit. So from that point going on, people started putting stuff in by their doors to block the door, to make noise, almost like some type of security system. And today, John D'Antonio, the policeman, advised everybody get a dog. Because that way nobody said don't take your axe inside, which I can't figure that out.
That should be the first thing. How does he kill people? An axe. Well, maybe we shouldn't have those just laying so handy by the
Correct.
door. Yeah, that
Correct.
would have been great.
So I think it's like I said, it's a fascinating story. At the same time, I think why doesn't have as much pull as other stories, right? Jack the Ripper and all those stories. And I think part of it is that he was committing crimes against the Sicilian community at the time when the killings were at their height. There's a wonderful ad from Piggly Wiggly of all people about that, come to Piggly Wiggly and they're cutting their pricing just like the Axeman.
Oh.
So there's a lot of joking going on because I don't think if you weren't of Sicilian heritage, maybe you didn't have as much of a fear.
Right.
That they certainly did, you know. And then of course we get to the first child he killed was in Gretna. A 2-year-old girl who died in her mother's arms, struck her across the head, which I think really opened the eyes of a lot of people across the city, because now it started to be like, well, now it's, he's not so much just on the outskirts. He's not just killing around New Orleans. Now he's in Gretna, killing over there.
Yeah, and that just shows the depravity.
Yes.
Because,
correct.
I mean, to kill a child is like, some murderers, they're like, oh, we don't do women
Correct.
or children. They have, I don't say ethics, but they do have a little line that they draw. But
Correct.
for him to do that, and in Gretna,
Correct.
it's just, it speaks volumes of,
It does.
that if you're going to do that. But let me ask you something real quick before you make your next point. Now, do you know that when he would kill, would it be like this or more like this?
I think with that part right there.
With this part, okay. With the blade.
Blade.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the
sharpened
reason
blade
I
part.
was asking is because in Villisca, it was this back part that
Gotcha.
he used.
No, because
I
they would
think,
have
more.
cuts across the.
Yeah. So he was using that. Okay.
Now I want to go back to Mary. Picture this.
Oh,
Mary
Sophia.
Mary dies. Mary dies in March 9th is when he attacks the little girl, Mary. Then comes March 13th, and he sends a letter to the Times-Picayune. If you've never read this letter, please go find the letter and read it. If you read it in my book, it's pretty. You can read it online. This letter is unbelievable.
It's chilling.
It's from hell. That's the way he does it. He goes off and basically says who he is, and that he loves jazz, and that if you're playing jazz on a certain night, he won't kill anybody. And he calls himself the worst demon from hell that you're ever going to meet. A lot of people do not believe he wrote the letter. They think that it was written by a composer who was trying to get his music out. And of all things, the music was called the Axeman's Jazz. So
Go figure.
But when I was doing my research for my book, I went and looked at the actual newspaper article, found the letter in the newspaper, and it was something that no other historians have picked up on, which I thought was kind of interesting. In the preamble to the letter in the newspaper reporter had stated that it was all handwritten. The letter was handwritten, and that the handwriting looked and matched exactly to other letters that had been written to the police chief, threatening him and also taunting him, which no one's ever mentioned in any book I've read.
Yeah.
That those letters. So I'm wondering, is there some file somewhere today, right? Probably not. Probably flooded over the course of many years, or disintegrated. But is there something to match now? You could match the handwriting, right?
Sure.
And you would know that the letter's written, back in early part of 1918. It's the same hand, So it's not this composer who wrote the letter. It was indeed the Axeman. The letter is fascinating, and I think you have to keep in mind too, the Jazz Night of New Orleans, which gets underplayed a lot. I remember that when the 300th anniversary came out, I read some articles about the Axeman, and they kind of downplayed that night. If you read the newspaper articles right around the same time, it was huge. Everyone around the city either was playing jazz, was at a bar, was at a saloon listening to jazz. Because they were making sure that that Axeman wasn't going to come kill them. So they certainly believed that the letter was from him, and the letter was telling them what to do.
Now, in the letter you were stating, you said that it said something like from hell.
Yes.
And that was kind of, I don't know, I'm just thinking of this now, but that was Jack the Ripper, didn't
Yes,
he? Like
he did.
say stuff in his
From hell.
letters, like from hell.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in this, he starts off, esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit, and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you New Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. And it's you read it, and and keep in mind too that night of jazz was actually the night before St. Joseph's Day, which, if you know anything about Sicilians, that's a huge day in New Orleans when everybody's cooking everything out. Well, they were busy listening to jazz instead. The next morning, the Times-Picayune put out a cartoon, picture for their article, called it The Witching Hour, and it shows this family surrounded by a piano. The grandmother's playing the piano, little kids are playing on little pots and pans, and the mother's out looking at the window, making sure the Axeman's not coming. The composer who wrote the music was able to use that for his score of the Axeman's Jazz, but this is it right here.
Let me show y'all this.
And it's just like I said, it showed kind of what it was like, what everybody was trying to do to avoid the Axeman,
Right. So, like during my lockdown,
yes,
I have karaoke. We do a thing of karaoke and no jazz. And way he gets, I kind of doing that thing.
So that would have been around March. He attacked 2 other people, no deaths, thankfully, until the very last one. He killed in October of 19. He killed a gentleman by the name of Mike Pepitone, and that's it. He disappeared. Never heard from again. Nobody ever attributed any other attack to him. It's interesting that Mike Pepitone, I'll follow through with this little story.
Yeah.
Mike Pepitone's wife, Esther, fled New Orleans after his death, ultimately met this gentleman who took her out to California. So she was living now as Esther Albano in California. So imagine it's December 1921, and you open the newspaper in New Orleans, and you see where Esther Albano in California had killed a gentleman by the name of Joseph Mumphrey.
Yes.
Who, with the statement of that was the man who killed her husband. And everyone at that point believed that was the Axeman.
Right.
That he was a pharmacist, I think, in New Orleans, and had left and had gone out to California, and she killed him. A good scholarship people have believed, or historians now believe, that at the time of the earlier killings around 1918, he was actually in jail. So he would not have been the Axeman. So it's kind of been disproven that it wasn't.
Now, is that actually true that she did kill him?
Oh, that is true.
That is true?
That's no doubt.
Because I've heard both.
That's
But that is true.
It's interesting because they really can't find proof of a Joseph Mumphrey. She killed somebody, right? They say his name's Joseph Mumphrey, but there's no proof that a Joseph Mumphrey ever existed in New Orleans, at least the spelling that they say it was. So it's a convoluted mess, I'd say, at that part of the story.
Yeah, I think that it kind of came on people's radar. You know how you were talking about the stories not like well known or well researched and stuff. I think it came to a lot of people's attention during American Horror Story when they had was that Coven and they had the Axeman and I think that really kind of started getting people's more attention. Like, oh, I didn't hear about that, and so more research and more
correct.
Kind of the focus on it.
It's funny. I was at French Quarter Fest I guess 2 weeks ago, and I was at the Abbey Bar.
Okay.
In the Abbey Bar, which is in the old part of Little Palermo, they have an axe sitting on the wall. That was there you go. So you see,
I didn't know that.
All that parts of the French Quarter, because that's kind of where they lived, and that's probably part of the mystique of New Orleans.
Because like I was telling you, and this as well, they have a axe that they found in the wall at the Haunted Hotel, and who knows, and they have the letter. Like it's blown up big and they have it. Yeah. And so it's just amazing how I just find it intriguing about how, because he's a serial killer and how that serial killers, to kind of go on a broad theory thing, but like some of them, they'll go on the killing sprees and then all of a sudden they'll just stop, like BTK.
Right.
Or like the Green River Killer, or even the Zodiac, and it's like, okay, you just all of a sudden stop,
right?
I'm thinking, in my unprofessional opinion, that they move somewhere else or some. I don't know, because I just don't see someone who gets such a thrill and such a control buzz about,
Right.
scaring all these people, and everybody's playing jazz because I said so, and
Right.
how can they just stop?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So they believe that if he was the cleaver back in 1910, that just based on how he would enter the houses and stuff like that, they think that perhaps he was in jail for that 6-year period that he disappeared. That perhaps he was arrested and then start again. Now, I'll take the to answer your question is that, but he started out with a meat cleaver, then he becomes an axe murderer, right?
Going up.
And did he go on somewhere else and at that point started using a gun or started using a knife? And it's just nobody makes the connection, because again, but for the detective who made the connection to the cleaver, it may never happen. Nobody makes that connection.
Because another story that's told in conjunction sometimes with the Axeman, Clementine Bernadette.
Yes. Yep.
She disappeared.
Correct.
Never heard from her again after she did all her stuff, in like Acadiana area,
right,
and all that. And then, they said, oh, no one knows where she went. It's like, where, like, do they have a...
Right.
Like, are they really... I have this theory, and as y'all know, like, it's a spirit that's making these people do it, or they are coming in human form and they do their work or whatever they decide, and they poof and they go on to the next one.
Sure.
The next era. Because I don't know how to explain how so many, they'll just disappear. Never, and you get such a thrill from it, and then...
Yeah, I mean, Jack the Ripper.
Jack
the Ripper is the prime example, because he's the first, I'd say, kind of line of all these people, and just disappeared.
Yeah.
What happened to him?
Yeah.
He again, it's that thrill, and again, you think about in terms of that 5-month period, and it's just he's attacking, and then gone.
Yeah.
And in my novel, that's kind of what I do. I kind of give the my version of what happened to him, and of course I'm not going to tell you, because you gotta read the book.
Look at him.
But it's
Smart.
it's what happened to him.
Right.
What is my theory as to what happened?
Okay, so we'll have to... You want to hold your book up, or
Sure.
I can hold it up?
There you go.
Okay. This is The Devil's Jazz, and it says The Haunted Chronicles of the Axeman of New Orleans. And so you can buy this. Where can they get this?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Barnes & Noble. And do you have like
I have a website, www.vincentlococo.com.
Okay. And this is, a great read, and you just go into so much detail about... You just kind of weave it all in, We were talking about how that there was a theory that maybe that the letters were sent by the composer of the Axeman. And do you think that was the case?
I don't think so. I think, like I said, I think I really don't think so. I think that the fact that the handwriting matched the handwriting that was sent to the police chief before, I think, has been missed, I'd say, in the historical record. And I think that when you read the letter, to me, it's so off kilter that it looks to be from a mind of somebody who is demented.
Yeah. You'd have to be demented, because the way, if you read and research about how that these people were killed, the first one is Joseph and Catherine.
Correct.
The first they were slit with the
razor blade,
the straight razor. Yeah, their throats were slit, and then no, that's not good enough. Look by the door. Here's the axe. The axe. And I don't know. I keep grabbing this, I guess for emphasis. But let me. And then is that how he started? Like, oh, I kind of like this axe thing instead of it's more you're not so close to the people. I don't know.
Right. And not, of course, like we said, not everybody died either. So he was seen, but nobody could really identify him.
Right. There's no sketch.
No, they said what he would wear. They said how high, his height, what he wore.
Did they do dark hat? Sketches back then, huh? Or no?
I mean, they must have. I mean, you think they would have? I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, I just thought about that. I've never seen, like, oh, this is how, like, even the Zodiac has a sketch
Correct.
of how he's looked. And I don't know why, because if people did actually see him, and
Correct.
I don't know if they were just so fearful or couldn't remember, or
I had a reader read my book and said they couldn't do a sketch because he was a spirit, so he had no face.
I think, well,
So
I'll write that down. That's kind of cool. Yeah, I mean, because that would kind of go along with my theory, but so he's attributed. I'm thinking, I saw this and I just wrote it down. 6 to 17 killed, if you believe that he was back in
correct.
the 1910.
Correct.
And then 6 to 14 injured.
Right.
It says.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
And they mostly were Italians.
Mostly Italians.
Yeah.
Sicilian immigrants. Most of them were grocery owners, little neighborhood grocery stores. In those days, they would live in the back half of the house, and the grocery store would be in the front part.
And he wouldn't rob or take anything.
Wouldn't rob or take anything. I think the first one he did, this would have been in 1910, he took the People's Mockingbird and took it out the cage. Well, took the cage with it. And then ultimately must have let it out because it turned up like 2 days later back at the house. It was sitting on the...
He was like, I'm not going with this X-Men. I'm back home. Oh, wow. See, I didn't know about that because, like, is the Mockingbird... I mean, you can go down rabbit holes, just crazy. Doubt. But, like, does it... Like, I have to look it up. Like, does it symbolize something that maybe... Like, why? I don't take nothing. I don't take any money. I don't take jewelry. I don't take nothing.
It wasn't sexual. There's no...
Right.
No
nothing like that.
For the answer to was it mafia related. And back then, we didn't call it the mafia here in New Orleans. It was the Black Hand. That's what it was known
the Black
for.
Hand, right.
And John D'Antonio, again, the Italian expert, his big thing was, like, they have a code of conduct, right? They didn't attack women.
Exactly.
And the Axeman was attacking women. That's how he dismissed this, as this is not the mafia, Black Hand. This is something totally different because they wouldn't, under their code.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, some people, they have, morals. Like, no, we're not going to do that, but we'll do this other thing.
Right.
So take me back to the 2-year-old because I'm not really familiar with that. Killing. She was the only one killed, or
no? Well, she was the only one killed.
Mm-hmm.
Her mom was. They were both struck. Her mother and father both struck. It was an interesting story because there was a little girl neighbor who came to the grocery early that morning. The grocery store was always open at 7 a.m. So I think she was coming to get milk. Went to the door and the door was locked. And instead of, I think she knew the girl. I think she knew the family, and instead she went around to the back door and noticed that the panel was missing. Instead of going in, she ran out to get a neighbor who was walking down the street. He came with her in the back, and he told her to go inside the panel. So she climbed through the panel, and he heard screaming momentarily, and she had found the body of the little girl. And I think the mom was in shock, just laying there with the daughter on her lap. And she came running out.
The X-Man,
mom. She saw the X-Man. And then she saw the mom holding the baby who was dead.
Okay, so the girl who found him saw the X-Man?
No,
the mom did that was holding the... Okay,
yeah.
All right.
And that was it became a sad story because the family, I think the mom ended up falsely accusing 2 neighbors, and they got arrested. And then the Jefferson Parish Police Department got involved, and they refused to talk to the New Orleans Police Department, who was trying to, what does this sound like, right? Who were trying to say this is the Axeman, and they didn't want to hear it.
Sure.
And it wasn't until, I want to say, after they were both of the neighbors were sentenced. One was sentenced to death, and the other was sentenced to a long-term prison sentence. And then it was on a St. Joseph's Day when Mrs. Cortemulia, the mother, recanted her story and said no, it wasn't them, and they got out of jail. In fact, interesting, but it just makes the story sad because it was these poor 2 guys.
Yeah, they almost.
And I think in that case, I think there were 2 axes that were found, and I think because of that, the neighbors, I think, were the ones who came over when they heard the screaming and busted the door down so everybody could go inside the house and see that scene, which must have been terrible.
Where do you know where in Gretna that it happened?
You know, I know I
can look it up
I
if
got
you
it somewhere in my book. If you can keep asking me
Because I
questions, I'm
work
gonna
over
find
in
it.
Gretna, so I mean I'll do like a drive.
It's funny because you read the names. It's like Marrero is like the police chief at the time, and
Yeah.
it's like there
Yeah.
it is, you know.
Right.
But I'm gonna find it. You can keep going. I'm gonna give
Okay.
I'll tell you where.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know why, and I have no answer to why I'm just like really attracted to the story about the Axemen, and then also about Villisca and Lizzie Borden, and I don't know why. I'm sure there's a psychiatrist or something.
Jefferson and 2nd Street, the corner.
Oh, okay. I don't think that's too far from where I work.
There you
Okay.
go. But be careful.
I know. But, because, I was thinking about the panel, and even though the girl, but I'm sure she was like smaller in stature
Right.
than what he is, a spirit.
Yes. So some of the
Go in.
grocery stores, because the grocery stores aren't there anymore, they became houses. But most of the story, if you go through the book, for example, you can find the address. Most of them are still there. And you can kind of see how it still it still looks like a grocery store, but it's a house now.
Right. I got you.
And there's a little not French Quarter, but those little outer areas of New Orleans.
Right.
And like I said, it's a sad tale, and it's a tale that is fascinating.
It is.
And the fact that he was never found makes it even more intriguing,
Intriguing, chilling, all the above. Can I see the book one more
You
time?
can.
All right, everybody. This has been, I enjoyed my conversation with Chip LoCoco, and this is his book, The Devil Jazz. Please go on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever, and get this book. And also, he's going to be a special guest at my haunted weekend lockdown as we continue to search for the Axeman again 2 years in a row. So he's going to be reading from the book and telling some stories, and I think it's really going to be great. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you'll join me again.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody, I'll see you next time. Have a good night.
Good night.